Hi everyone. In this video, we are going to continue to explore approaches and methods in English language teaching. As an overview of the whole module, we have defined some key terms regarding approaches and methods in English language teaching. We also explored the most notable methods and approaches in early ELT history, including total physical response and the audio-lingual method. In this video, we are going to focus on more contemporary approaches and examine today's perspectives on methods and approaches. Okay, so just as a reminder, we often think about methods in the lowercase m, which means a collection of classroom practices that you can use. Or you can think of methods with the uppercase M, and this seems to mean a fixed set of classroom practices that serve as a prescription and therefore do not allow variation. We explored some methods in the previous lesson. As you also remember, Richards and Rogers write about methods as an umbrella term comprising approach, design, and procedure. And this is an infographic that you can refer to in order to understand what an approach is, what design is, and what procedure means in this framework. Now, let's talk about communicative language teaching today. Basically, the goal of communicative language teaching is to develop communicative competence among learners. Learners learn a foreign or second language in order to communicate, and they communicate to learn. So this is also a special characteristic that we actually acquire another language through communication and to communicate in that language. So what is communicative competence? You might have been familiar with some of these models here, especially CLIL, 1983. In this model, there are 4 components: grammatical competence, strategic competence, socio-linguistic competence, and discourse competence. Sales Mercier, Doignet, and Thoreau in 1995 expanded this module to include sociocultural competence and actional competence as part of sociolinguistic competence here. Discourse competence refers to your textual knowledge, how the text is selected, sequenced, how the words and structures are arranged in order to create a discourse. So when you think about a sentence can be isolated, but when a sentence is put into context, or multiple sentences are put into context, what you have is a discourse. Linguistic competence refers to your knowledge of the language. It includes grammatical knowledge as well as lexical knowledge here. Actional competence in Sales Mercier, Doignet, and Thoreau's framework refers to your functional knowledge, your understanding of the functions of the language. It indicates the ability to match actional intent with linguistic form. And you can think of the different speech acts in our language, like to apologize, to make a request, to thank someone. And in order to do that, you need to be able to use language to carry out those speech acts. Sociocultural competence here refers to your knowledge of cultures and society, how you should behave in a particular culture, in a particular context, for example. And finally, strategic competence refers to your ability to use your metacognitive strategies. They may include coping strategies to prepare breakdown in communication. Or you can think of these as communication strategies. When the communication breaks down, how can you repair it? How you can ask for confirmation, comprehension, clarification, for example. Okay, so I found this comparison in the Richards and Rogers book very useful. This is a comparison between the audio-lingual method and communicative language teaching. Since we have already explored the audio-lingual method, I thought this is also a really good way to learn about the differences between this method and communicative language teaching. I'm going to just point out some key differences here. The first one here is that in communicative language teaching, meaning is really important. It is not about memorizing a sentence structure. It is not about drilling and focusing on a sentence structure or discrete grammatical items, but it is about communicating meaning and understanding meaning. Dialogues are also used here, but the focus is on the communicative functions. Learners are not supposed to memorize dialogues or sentence structures or patterns in the dialogues. Contextualization is also really important because we can only understand meaning in context. Language learning is learning to communicate, as I already mentioned in the previous slide. And so effective communication is sought here. It's not about mastery of the linguistic system, but it is about effective communication. Drilling may occur, but not as often as in the audiolingual method. Comprehensible pronunciation is sought. Again, it's not about sounding like a native speaker or mastering the phonetic system of the target language. There are more differences here. In terms of grammatical explanation, in the audiolingual method, interestingly, grammatical explanation is avoided. But in the communicative language teaching, it can be helpful, especially when you draw learners' attention to grammar when they are already focused on meaning. The target linguistic system will be learned best through the process of struggling to communicate. This is really different in the sense that learners are not going to learn one linguistic item or one grammatical form or one vocabulary item at a time in isolation from communication. But they acquire the linguistic system through communication and through the process of struggling to communicate. And again, here, there are more differences that you can explore. And I find this list, again, very useful. And it is cited in Richards and Rogers 2001, the textbook that you have. So the communicative language teaching approach is actually a really broad term. The content-based approach can be understood as part of communicative language teaching because it meets many of the criteria or distinguishing features of the communicative language teaching approach in comparison with other approaches. In the content-based approach, learners acquire language and learn a new language by engaging with content. And in this case, content is the information and subject matter that we learn or communicate through language. You may think about content areas like mathematics, geography, physics, music, and language is used to convey content in this case. In content-based learning, decisions about content are made first, and then other decisions are made later. The assumptions in this approach are that people learn a language more successfully when using language as a means of acquiring information rather than as an end itself. And content-based teaching better reflects people's needs for learning a second language. We learn a second language to acquire new information, new knowledge, to read about the different content areas, for example, and to communicate in that content area. Another assumption is that content provides a coherent framework to link and develop all the language skills. So let's take a look at a few examples in the US K-12 context. In the US, there are more than 5 million English learners in the pre-K to 12 public school system, and this number accounts for about 10% of the student population in the US. Because of the need to teach English to these students, there are different instructional models that have been used, including the content-based model, sheltered instruction model, transitional bilingual education, and dual language programs. You can also think of these 4 models as related to the content-based model. So what is content-based instruction in this context? Usually in this instructional model, English learners develop language competencies through content-based lessons. The content of other subjects are the basis for language development. Teachers teaching in this model have ESL certification so that they are qualified to teach English learners. And usually these classes are separate from content classes. So you can see that even when this is content-based instruction, the purpose is actually to develop English language proficiency among English learners. Now, the sheltered instruction model is also very interesting in the US. In this case, the classes may not be separate from the content classes. Teachers use specialized techniques to develop both content and language knowledge among the students. The main goal here is to teach content, but teaching techniques need to be suitable for English learners. Teaching staff consists of content teachers as well as teachers with ESL certification. This model has become more common in the US context. What it means is that students take regular content classes, but teachers need to know the techniques in order to help them to understand the content and at the same time develop their language proficiency. Within the sheltered instruction model, the CEOP model, as listed on the slide here, is very common in the US, and there are a lot of resources that you can explore if you're interested in this model and see how applicable it is to your context. In the European context, you may hear of the concept of CLIL more. And CLIL here stands for Content and Language Integrated Learning. According to Coyle et al. 2010, Content and Language Integrated Learning, or CLIL, is a dual-focused educational approach in which an additional language is used for the learning and teaching of both content and language. So when you use this approach, you may have the whole program or a course or a lesson that covers both content and language to develop students' knowledge of the content area as well as to develop their language skills. Maybe you can have a course using psychology as content, and through that content, you design lessons to also develop students' language proficiency. Okay, so next, apart from the content approach that can be considered part of communicative language teaching, we also have the task-based approach. And this approach has been also discussed and researched extensively in English language teaching or in language teaching in general. Now, when you think about tasks, you think about activities where the target language is used by the learner for communicative purposes to achieve an outcome. And learners function primarily as language users rather than language learner. Another definition of a task that I like is that it involves learners comprehending meaning or communicating meaning to achieve an objective. The focus here is on meaning and on language use rather than on practicing linguistic items. To implement task-based language teaching, you may carry out different activities in the pre-task stage, during the main task cycle, and during the post-task or language focus stage. In the pre-task stage, you introduce students to the topic and the task. Usually, there should not be much time dedicated to teaching linguistic items discretely. During the task cycle, students need to perform the task, and they may have some planning time and then task performance, and you may also require students to report the task outcome or to present the task outcome to the class. In the post-task stage, you may focus on reviewing language. So students may compare their performance to more competent language users. You may also analyze the language that they use, help students to reflect on their language, and may carry out further language practice. that is a really short explanation of task-based language teaching. But if you would like to learn more, I actually have a course on this in the Actually Speak app. The course has 5 modules with 18 videos from Dr. Rod Ellis, who's very famous for task-based language teaching, videos from me, and from Dr. Hoàng Nguyen from Columbia University in New York. There are concrete examples, demonstrations, and tasks that you can complete with Actually AI or individually or with another learner. So I encourage you to try it, but I'm going to give you more instructions on how to get started. And I'm actually thinking of doing a small experiment to see how you can acquire knowledge like this through a course on your mobile phone. So stay tuned for the instructions. Finally, I would like to cover competence-based language teaching very quickly. This approach focuses on equipping learners with the precise skills, knowledge, and behaviors needed to perform effectively in real-world situations. That sounds pretty comparable to task-based language teaching. It emphasizes measurable outcomes and practical application. So this is pretty much related to outcome-based instruction or outcome-based education. That when you design a course or lesson, you need to think about what students will be able to do as the result of instruction and define the outcomes in very measurable terms so that you can assess students' performance and achievements at the end of a lesson or a course. So this approach is very outcome-oriented. It is also learner-centered because learners learn to perform tasks that they will have to perform in real-life situations. It is also very assessment-driven because you need to define the outcomes very specifically and measurably so that you can say whether students can successfully perform the tasks. Other foci that I want to highlight here include the fact that it is often work-related and survival-oriented. It often prepares learners to perform different tasks in their work environment, or it is suitable for new immigrants and refugees to learn skills to survive in the new environment. This approach also leads to the standards movement that is very influential in the US. Usually when teachers design lessons here, they need to associate the lessons with very specific standards that are outlined by their schools or their states. As I mentioned, it is commonly used for immigrants and refugees. Some of the competencies or tasks that they may have to learn to do include applying for a job, preparing for an interview, or performing different tasks that are important for their everyday life, including going to the bank and opening an account or reading a check to understand what it means. As I mentioned, this approach is very common among programs for immigrants and refugees. And in my city, Pittsburgh, there is this organization called Literacy Pittsburgh that offers classes for immigrants and refugees. And as you can see here, some of the things that learners learn include getting a better job or being comfortable talking to doctors and teachers. These are the important tasks that they need to do in their everyday life. Now, with so many approaches and methods in English language teaching, you may ask what the best method is. This has brought us to what is called post-method pedagogy, pedagogy that goes beyond methods. This is a shift from prescriptive methods to flexible, context-sensitive teaching approaches. There is no best method out there that can fit all contexts. The emphasis here is on teacher autonomy, context awareness, and critical thinking. In an article by Bax 2003, the author criticizes communicative language teaching because the assumption is that it's the best teaching method out there, then it fits all contexts, and context is not as important as the method. Therefore, post-method pedagogy highlights contextual sensitivity. It highlights the importance of understanding sociocultural and situational contexts. When you are a teacher working in a particular school, in a particular country, in a particular political environment, a lot of contextual factors are just powerful and really important in affecting decisions in the classroom. It also highlights teacher autonomy in the sense that it empowers teachers to design contextually appropriate methods. Reflective teaching is a core practice in this pedagogy. Another key principle is learner-centered needs, in the sense that teachers need to focus on learners' needs, experiences, and linguistic backgrounds. Personally, I think that learner-centeredness in this sense is important in all approaches and methods. And teachers don't just use one method, but may combine elements from multiple approaches to suit specific teaching contexts. So here you can see context and the learners are the center of this post-method pedagogy. As teachers, you may think about how you can apply post-method pedagogy. These are some practical applications. First, teachers should engage in reflective practice where they regularly self-evaluate and adapt their teaching strategies. To me, this doesn't mean that theory and research are not important. Teachers still need to learn about theory, approaches, and methods, but through that knowledge, they need to articulate their own beliefs and also think about integrate evidence from research to improve their teaching. Another practical application is contextualized lesson planning by incorporating local culture, student interest, and real-world application. It is really important to really understand the students and integrate their interest, their background knowledge, and the local context into lesson planning. And finally, already mentioned that teachers can use blended methods by combining traditional and modern techniques to fit the context and the learners. So I hope that the recording is helpful as an overview of some important methods and approaches in English language teaching.